the fact that, generations ago there were two genders, there were two sexes. There still are two sexes, but today I think we probably have about 9 genders, and that doesn't diminish any other gender within the gender identity set.
But in Ireland, the cases that you have referred to, with males with GRCs being sent to prison, did you do any analysis prior to or during the evidence sessions of the bill to work out the impact of males with GRCs being housed in female prisons?
So what we did do at the time was look at other jurisdictions that had passed similar legislation to us and the lived experience in that country. And again, probably because we were one of the first, and you're nearly one of the first countries to introduce this kind of legislation, there wasn't an awful lot to look at. But we did do some work. The prison thing, the shared dressing room spaces, and the school toilets were the 3 things that came up in the jurisdictions that we looked at. But again, the instances were so minute. I genuinely think we have a debate that happened a number of months ago because we have a number of prisoners in Limerick prison in the southwest of our country who are in a female prison who identified as female after they had been arrested and charged. And to my mind, first of all, the law is that they can change their gender if that's what they want to do.
But obviously, I know you've covered a little bit about justice and health when my colleague asked, but just more about the gender pay gap, because we have heard this from some of the witnesses that have come forward to talk about that. So just a little bit about, your concerns and your thoughts on how you tackled this area.
Again, embarrassingly so, none of these things were identified as issues around the time of the enactment of the legislation. And so because of the way the legislation was drafted, there is no data collection other than in the General Register's office, I would present and change my gender, and all of my legal documents would go from being a she to whatever I would identify as. And so insofar as collecting data to feed into justice legislation, employment legislation, it's not there.
How can we guarantee, how can we ensure that trans men will still be on the right registers for cervical screening for those kinds of tests, and trans women will still be on the right lists for prostate tests and that kind of thing?
So that if Regina Doherty presented to change, my identity and my gender tomorrow to Reginald Doherty, that data would be collected within the GRO. But because of data protection and the GDPR legislation that we've all got from the European Union, that data can't be shared with anybody. So even if we could, delve into that data to say, actually, there are 50 women in Dublin that changed their gender to men, let's make sure we capture them for cervical screening or for breast check or whatever it happens to be. We don't have the ability to access that right now. So to our mind, to change the legislation to have the massive positive impact on a very small community's life was a very good thing for us to do. If we could help those people in that community, whatever of the gender that they were outside of male and female, to live a fulfilled life recognised by the state, it was a good thing to do. What I'm suggesting to you is that some of the concerns that were raised at the time was those spaces, female-only spaces. And so prisons is one that's used a lot. Dressing rooms are used, particularly around our children. The example of toilets in secondary schools or primary schools are used. And when we balanced and looked at other jurisdictions had those problems or issues materialised, there were very, very little evidence to say that they had.
How did you go about addressing that? Did you have other groups of religion, women of faith, whether they were, accessing services or single-sex spaces? Did that come across any of the work you were doing in your 2015 Act?
Again, to be very honest with you, we had very little acrimony. We did have concerns that were expressed, but they were actually expressed to us in relatively muted tones.
But it would break the religion of that female if she was
Sorry,
to
I
find,
understand your
if that female was to find out later on that that doctor, and she didn't have an opportunity to know anything, because that trans person has the right to privacy, but also that person of religion and belief has the right to religion as well. So how do we see, you know, and it'd be good if you could give, you know, some kind of answer to this. But how do we see a happy medium that we respect both sides and we come out with a balanced view that can help that service?
If we legally recognise 7 genders, well, then I don't think I should have any problem telling you I'm a trans man, trans woman, non-binary, intersex, you know, non-gender. If I am that gender, like, I don't have any problem with you asking me my gender. I tell you I'm a woman. If the lads sitting around beside you, I'm quite sure that they wouldn't have any problem. So therefore, if you were a trans woman or a trans man or an intersex, you know, why would you feel, I don't know what the word is, marginalised or put upon by having to say what you are? Because to my mind, in the scenario that you've just described, each person has to be respected and treated with dignity. And the person that has religious beliefs has a right to be treated by a woman if she wants to be treated by a woman. If she goes in and she picks a non-binary doctor, well, then she might find it more difficult to find one. But you know what I mean? I'm not being facetious. I think there's nothing wrong with asking to be treated by a female woman doctor, as you know, because there distinctly is something different between a woman and a trans woman.